Good morning. My name is Tom Firestone. I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Baker McKenzie, and it's my honor to make a few opening remarks today and to talk a little bit about why Baker McKenzie is so happy to partner with the Global Center on projects like this. Let me just back up by saying before I joined Baker McKenzie, I worked in the US Department of Justice for about 14 years, and I specialized in the area of transnational organized crime. And I was consistently struck by how frequently we see a connection between weak rule of law, weak civil society in foreign countries, and the export of criminal activity, including violent extremism from those countries. We frequently look at violent extremism, anti-money laundering, combating transnational organized crime as law enforcement issues, which of course they are. But there's a deeper component to this, which is looking at the absence of the rule of law in the societies that give rise to these phenomena, the weak development of civil society, the weak judiciary in those countries. And what I love about the Global Center is the approach that they take to looking at the root causes of these problems, attacking transnational organized crime, money laundering, violent extremism through strengthening civil society and the rule of law domestically in the home countries. I think that's a great approach. There aren't a lot of organizations that do it. And I think that's really one of the valuable contributions that Global Center makes to the public debate on these issues. And so we're very happy to partner with them on these kinds of projects. And the other thing I want to say, working in the private sector with large companies that are often investing in high-risk emerging markets, I see how important it is for there to be dialogue between the public sector and the private sector on these issues. I try to go back and forth between both worlds. I work a lot with NGOs in the area of anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy. And as I say, I also work with large companies on corporate compliance programs. And it's great to have this kind of dialogue because when you work with the private companies, you see the kinds of issues that they're encountering on a day-to-day basis. And one can impart that knowledge and experience to the nonprofit world to inform their policy recommendations. Similarly, when one talks to the nonprofit world, we see emerging best practices, expectations of the private sector from civil society actors, and we can then take those back to the private sector to help them develop best practices. All of which to say is that this kind of dialogue is extremely important. And I think we've got a great program today, great speakers who are going to talk about all of these issues and the possibilities for public-private cooperation in combating violent extremism, money laundering, and other problems. So with that, once again, Baker McKenzie is delighted to cooperate with the Global Center. We've been doing so for a number of years now. We look forward to continuing to do so, and we would certainly encourage other private sector companies to partner with the Global Center as well. With that, I'm going to stop talking so we can turn it over to the real experts who have much more to say than I do. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Howie Wachtel, to start us off. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Tom. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. And first off, let me, of course, thank Tom and Baker McKenzie for co-hosting this event and all of the support you've given to the Global Center over the years. We really appreciate that. My name is Howie Wachtel. I'm the Director of Global Sanctions Policy and Strategy at PayPal. Before that, I spent a number of years in a variety of government positions at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, at the State Department, and the National Security Council. And I guess most importantly, and relevant to this conversation, is I recently became a member of the Board of Directors on the Global Center on Cooperative Security. Now, just some sort of general background on the work of the Global Center before we kick off what is sure to be sort of a great panel discussion with the folks we have. The Global Center on Cooperative Security is an independent, non-governmental organization that works to address the root causes of violent extremism, recognizing the role that improving good governance, financial inclusion, and human rights play in fostering a much more secure global community. The Global Center achieves its goals through policy analysis and the delivery of capacity development programs, working closely with civil society organizations, criminal justice practitioners, governments, the United Nations, and of course, the private sector. The organization focuses its programming on 4 mutually reinforcing objectives. First, the Global Center believes that resilient communities are best able to tackle the underlying factors of global extremism. That is why it partners with civil society organizations across the world to provide them with the knowledge, the resources, the expertise, and the networks to address the drivers of terrorism. Second, the Global Center advances human rights and the rule of law to prevent and respond to terrorism and violent extremism. Where criminal justice systems are weak or inaccessible, violent extremism, as we all know, can thrive. The Global Center has trained thousands of police officers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and corrections officials to equip them with the knowledge and the skills they need to handle terrorism cases in a manner that's consistent with human rights and the rule of law in countries that are most impacted, such as Pakistan, Mali, and Indonesia. Third, the Global Center helps governments, banks, and private sector institutions combat illicit finance to criminal and violent extremist organizations. The Global Center has worked with over 200 institutions and businesses to build transparent, accountable, and inclusive financial systems in places like Ethiopia, Jordan, and Iraq. And finally, fourth, the Global Center promotes multilateral cooperation and rights-based standards in counterterrorism based on the belief that policies to address violent extremism are more effective when they are globally informed and locally grounded. The Global Center has advised over 150 governments and multilateral organizations in both the design and implementation of those policies, ensuring that the experiences of civil society experts, human rights defenders, local practitioners, and those directly affected by terrorism are all carefully considered. Now, having worked on counterterrorism and sanctions policy myself at the United Nations, I know all too well how oftentimes these spaces are siloed and highly politicized, with very few opportunities for interaction, let alone cooperation and agreement. Terrorism and counterterrorism are often viewed as the sole purview of governments, and in particular, intelligence agencies, the security sector, and law enforcement, rather than as a global issue demanding a whole of society approach. The Global Center is determined to break down some of these silos and create partnerships between governments, corporations, and community organizations. And in the spirit of that inclusive cooperative approach, we're thrilled to welcome two new members to the organization's board of directors, Layla Bokhari and David McGowan. Layla is a former state deputy minister with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a state secretary at the Office of the Norwegian Prime Minister. She has a long-standing career in counterterrorism research and policy work. David is vice president of global protection services at Tiffany & Co., where he manages a formidable range of corporate security responsibilities and is also the former president of the board of directors of the International Security Management Association. Layla and David bring tremendous passion and expertise and will surely expand the Global Center's network of partners and thought leaders, and they truly do embody our desire to continue growing our partnerships. Now, during today's 1.5 hour panel discussion, our panel will examine how business operations are both affected by and have an effect on violent extremism, how the impact of violent extremism and counterproductive responses to it can be mitigated, and finally, how all of this connects and comes together as we discuss broader and emergent security trends. We have a fantastic group of panelists with very diverse backgrounds, everything from law enforcement to academia and philanthropy, to the IT sector and corporate security and corporate social responsibility, and we're all looking forward to this. Before I introduce the panelists, just a few housekeeping matters for everyone. To ask a question or if you need help, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave time at the end to answer questions that were submitted throughout the chat, and you're welcome to send them throughout the discussion at any point in time. Thanks to those of you who have already submitted questions before the event. We will try to address as many of these as possible following the discussion of the panelists. This event will be recorded until the Q&A, at which point we will end the recording. And at this time, I think it's my pleasure to kick off our discussion and introduce our panelists. You should have all received their bios via email. First, we have Vonda Felba Brown. She's a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. We also have John Frank, the vice president of UN Affairs at Microsoft. Niall Brennan is the vice president and global head of strategic security partnerships and engagement at SAP Global Security. And finally, we have Mariko Silver, the president and CEO of the Henry Luce Foundation. The structure of our conversation is as follows. I will just basically ask each panelist to answer some key questions of relevance to how terrorism and counterterrorism is shaping their sector or field of expertise. We will then welcome the panelists to reflect on each other's perspectives, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end, both from each other and from the general audience. Let's kick things off with Vonda. Vonda, given your background, given your expertise, it would be great if you could reflect on the state of current conflict dynamics, like asymmetric warfare, for example, and how the global health crisis and its economic and social impacts might shape these in the years to come. And also, what trends might we expect in illicit economies with respect to drug smuggling, human trafficking, terrorist financing, those sorts of things? Over to you.
Thank you, Howie. It's excellent to be part of this panel. I look very much forward to our conversation. We and the world are still really coming only to grasps with the significance of the pandemic that has had really profound effects, both on the lives of each of us, but also, in my view, profound structural effects in the distribution of power between non-state armed actors and states, with the structural change really privileging the non-state armed actors. Why is that? Well, first of all, the pandemic has pushed some 150 million people into poverty. That's only so far through about August. The number is likely to grow. Essentially, in 8 months, the pandemic has managed to erase 25 years of anti-poverty work globally. This is enormous. Let us think about the profound effect in 8 months. 25 years of anti-poverty work have been erased. Moreover, they have been erased in ways that do not necessarily allow those who have fallen into poverty and extreme poverty to recover their status in middle class. Oftentimes, people have been forced to liquidate all of their productive assets, all of their human capital assets, with families having to pull children out of school, sometimes children having to participate in a variety of illegal economies just to bring income for basic food. Some families being forced to sell their cell phones, which means they cannot connect to basic communications, they cannot access schooling. Really profound, dramatic effects, whether we are talking about places in Latin America, places in Africa or Asia. Of course, those effects are also dramatically felt in places like the United States, but they are particularly acute in very large parts of the world. So India today is facing the biggest recession since the 70s, a recession that's likely going to deepen. Mexico and Latin America are facing a recession not seen in decades, with GDP losses of 5%, 10%, really massive amounts. So the impact on people has been dramatic. Well, what does that mean? As employment has evaporated, has vanished, many people, as I prefaced, are seeking employment in illegal economies. The illegal economies have really not been disrupted by the pandemic. Traffickers have to sometimes adopt ways in which they traffic, whether in the drug trade is smuggling drugs through larger shipments, as opposed to smurfing, dividing the shipments across many smaller packages. But nonetheless, many illegal economies continue to be essentially thriving, and they are now a predominant source of employment for many people. Moreover, with very, very few exceptions, no violent armed group has responded to UN Secretary Gutierrez's call for a ceasefire during the pandemic, most have continued their violent struggle and even increased their violent struggle while taking advantage of the pandemic, incorporating it into their narratives, and often becoming the principal providers for impoverished population. That is nothing new. Both criminal groups and militant and terrorist groups have long provided governance in large parts of the world. They have long provided security as well as other public services to local populations, having thus built up political capital. But the scope and scale at which they are able to do so as a result of the pandemic has increased. Meanwhile, government capacity has dramatically shrunk, whether this is government capacity to field police officers, to have resources to pay for them, or for park rangers, for example, to protect protected areas from poaching or logging, or whether this is to put money into economic programs to address the immediate hardships of the pandemic, or more broadly, to create more equitable societies in which large territories are not left festering with minimal government presence, often inadequate and even problematic governance presence, and non-state actors are the primary providers. So the bonds between states and society as a result of the pandemic have weakened in large parts of the world. The state coercive as well as non-coercive capacities have been dramatically decreased as a result of the pandemic. And the political capital of criminal groups and militant groups has increased while their financial resources have not been significantly diminished. Now, obviously, I am talking at a very global level. There are nuances and differences for particular groups. Not every single criminal or militant group has been able to weather the pandemic in the same way. Some are more effective than others. But nonetheless, this is the broad trend of the structural shift toward non-state armed actors that will last for a considerable amount of time. I want to make one last comment here, and that is you asked how we at the beginning about particular illicit economies, and I want to highlight illicit economies in natural resources, such as wildlife trafficking, which could have well been the source of the pandemic. It could have been legal wildlife trade or illegal wildlife trade and logging. They have long been enormous problems, intensifying problems, and they are at the source of the pandemic. Viral spillover as a result of natural resource destruction, as a result of habitat loss, particularly forest loss, as well as direct trade in wild animals is what's allowing the virus to jump from animals to humans, the zoonosis process. Such a jump occurs every 3 years, and there have been several epidemics prior to coronavirus. Coronavirus is no surprise. It was bound to happen. The only surprise is how long both governments and society at large have been willing to absorb the risks and have not focused appropriately on mitigating the costs by preserving the environment better. But unfortunately, the very negative effect of the pandemic is that the pressure on logging and wildlife trafficking has not abated. In fact, it has significantly increased, with vested interest being able to lobby governments to weaken environmental regulation and magnifying logging, whether this is Brazil or Indonesia, because governments are so eager for any kind of quick resources, any kind of quick money, any kind of quick taxes. And because desperate populations become artisanal poachers, become artisanal loggers, as they simply cannot obtain any legal livelihoods. The consequence of that is that the pandemic is just amplifying factors that will advance the speed with which the next viral spillover and a potential pandemic arrive.
Thanks very much for that, Vanda. Just one follow-up question. We're seeing increasingly that peace settlements and transitional justice mechanisms can be especially challenging when they involve sanctioned terrorist organizations. And yet there is a growing body of evidence and interest in increasing efforts to reach agreements with these different groups and organizations. Do you think that this is a viable approach? And if so, how might the US and multilateral bodies sort of adapt their approaches and policies when they're trying to achieve peace with these groups?
Thank you, Howie. And it's important to think of this tool also in the context of COVID and what this means. I outlined this broad scenario of states becoming relatively weaker vis-a-vis non-state actors. Now, way before the pandemic, governments have negotiated with both terrorist and militant groups and with criminal groups, whether those negotiations were known, public, and to some extent transparent, or whether they were hidden and clandestine, whether they had beneficial and benevolent outcomes as their objectives, such as to achieve peace, or whether it's governments using criminal groups for particular purposes, perhaps outsourcing counterinsurgency efforts to them, or outsourcing the governance of particular areas, such as slum areas, to them. Now, there's been often pause and uncertainty about when it is appropriate to reach for negotiations that are meant to bring peace. Particularly challenging is the issue whether to negotiate with criminal groups. I would say that's even more contested than with terrorist groups. After all, as we are meeting today, the negotiations between the United States and Taliban produced a deal between the two entities in November, and currently the Taliban is negotiating with the Afghan government what is Afghanistan's perhaps greatest chance to achieve a peace after decades of fighting. But nonetheless, the process is enormously difficult, that it is far more likely that the negotiations will break down than they will succeed. In Nigeria, the Nigerian government has repeatedly attempted to negotiate with Boko Haram, a very brutal, heinous militant group that essentially rules simply through plunder and brutality. In 2016, the government of Colombia has negotiated a deal with the leftist guerrillas, the FARC, despite years and decades of narrative that the FARC is merely a criminal cartel, that the government should never make a deal. Now, the deal in Colombia, like all the other deals I mentioned, are enormously contested, controversial, and politically sensitive, both internationally and domestically. And there is as much opposition to the deal, to any negotiations and a possible deal, as there is support for them. Nonetheless, it's a tool that, in my view, is important and needs to be part of the policymakers' toolkit. The question is when it is applied, with what red lines, with what kind of objectives, what kind of limitations. And here is really where the meat of the issue is. Oftentimes, the government wants to negotiate from a position of strength, but will be forced to negotiate only when it has reached a stalemate with the group. I would posit that merely engaging with a militant group or criminal group through any kind of negotiations strengthens the group, strengthens it politically. That's a significant cost. That's not the cost that should prevent negotiation, but it's a cost that needs to be counted into. So my broad answer is those negotiations should not be excluded. Coronavirus will, in fact, make the negotiations more likely and more necessary, whether it's negotiating access with vaccine distribution to territories controlled by criminal or terrorist groups, a humanitarian imperative, but also public safety, global public safety imperative, or whether it is negotiating much broader deals. The devil and the angel, however, are in the details. What are the lead lines? What are the limitations? What kind of constraints, what kind of guarantees are put in place, so that the deals don't merely become a formalized handing over of power to brutal groups without any kind of accountability.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanda. Let's move to John. John, given the increased amount of attention and time individuals are spending online due to the COVID-19 pandemic, cybersecurity concerns have increased, and so do concerns around online radicalization and recruitment to violent extremism. How do you view these developments, and how is a company like Microsoft responding to these challenges?
Thank you, Howie, and thanks to the Global Center for, I've got a bar here, I mute myself, for the invitation to participate today. I think it's quite, we've all moved online. We're spending all our time here. And broadly speaking, our vulnerabilities as well as our opportunities are more highlighted. Just this morning, there's news accounts of cyber attacks, so-called crypto attacks on that are targeting vaccine trials. We're just, everything's moved online, and we've seen a great deal of acceleration towards that, but maybe not the maturity for cybersecurity practices. On the terrorist content side, generally the news is really not that bad in terms of what's happening online. We've seen less content and there's fewer removals. And broadly speaking, perhaps we're, the challenges we saw with ISIS a few years ago with highly produced propaganda have really diminished as ISIS has essentially lost its war. But the lessons from that experience, I think, now that we can look back, should be instructive for us, because there was a time when there was just the focus that, the problem with foreign fighter recruitment in Europe is online activity. And the EU Internet Forum really began these discussions several years ago, and the European Commission and the Council of Ministers brought together the companies, including Microsoft, which I represented, to tell us that we needed to take down terrorist content within 2 hours, then within 90 minutes, then within 75 minutes, then within 60 minutes. And it was this ever-changing thing that if we just shorten the time. And of course, we should take down terrorist content. But the response I had was, that's great, we're doing this, but what are governments doing to address those root causes of, why are people becoming radicalized? And I don't think we've fully addressed that. I'll come back to that. But coming out of it, it was first the EU Internet Forum, and then there's the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism that was formed in 2017 by leading companies, so we could cooperate and try to work on these issues together. And then I think it was making progress, but it was really the attack at Christchurch and the live streaming of it that fundamentally shifted us into a stronger course of action. And so the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Ardern, convened companies and pushed companies with President Macron, forming the Christchurch Call to counter violent extremism. And that has led to a professionalization of GIFCT. It has an executive director, staff. It also has an independent advisory board that includes national governments, as well as advisors from civil society. So it's trying to, put together just very discrete, important solutions for when there is a violent incident. How do we prevent, the uploading and streaming and repetition of content from those attacks? And fortunately, I think there have been fewer attacks, but I also think that industry and governments have worked out in a new governance model of cooperation, a real life solution to a terrible problem. I want to go back to one of the other lessons, though. There was also a great deal of discussion about creating counter narrative, and if we could just present people the right content at the right moment, we could somehow shift the dynamic for the radicalization process. And I've always been a little skeptical that, I'd like to see the numbers to see, is that really effective, or is this making us feel good? And I think that we don't have definitive evidence, but I think that we ought to approach that with understanding the limitations of it. There was a study done, sponsored by the State Department in Brussels, where I was based for the European Union, Government Affairs Office of Microsoft, where community organizers went in and held conversations and convened roundtables of people in Molenbeek, the neighborhood of Brussels from which the terrorist had come. And showing the proposed counter narrative to a group of students from young people from the neighborhood, let's just say they did not give it 5-star ratings on the apps. It just didn't speak to them, and they found it really, it was really difficult. Now, in that study, though, there were a great deal, the women of Molenbeek and the students of Molenbeek came back with very similar answers about what do you do to address the terrorist threat or the recruitment of terrorists in Molenbeek. The answer was better schools, keeping kids from getting isolated because of petty crime or drug crimes, which would kind of destroy their future and leave them no opportunity, and better jobs. And kind of going back to root causes, those were the things that at least the people of Molenbeek were saying that they believed would reduce the attraction to violent extremism from their community. And so I think it is important to think about root causes in addition to what the online world can do. Now, perhaps the biggest transformation we've seen, though, stepping back a little bit, is also in the current world, disinformation. We run an annual survey of 16,000 people around the world to measure the civility of people's conduct online. And with the current pandemic, and I don't know how, there must be a word for us spending all of our time staring at a computer screen, but the increased online time that we have, overall, the good news is we've seen a 4% increase in what we consider civility online. But it's been highly variable. It's 9% up in APAC. Central and Eastern Europe are down significantly. So it's, the bottom 5 of civility during COVID is, it's Belgium, Denmark, Turkey, Netherlands, United Kingdom, where it has gotten worse. So the net effects, I'm sorry, that was just one aspect, but actually it's, there's high variability, but the biggest cause is people taking out their frustrations from being online all the time. But secondly, the disinformation. We're all relying, we're all sharing this phenomenon, this global phenomenon of the COVID pandemic, and yet our capacity to get information is challenged. And I think that, we saw a few years ago, we could kind of grasp this idea, well, it's foreign interference. But now the disinformation is entangled between foreign and domestic in ways that make it a very challenging problem for us. So I think that that will be a major challenge for the online world and tech companies that provide platforms, that we've got to figure out how to work on this, but also taking the lesson from terrorist content. It can't just be things that we do online. We're going to need to step back and understand perhaps root causes. Why is disinformation happening and why is it being received? So in summary, there's some good news, there's some concerning news, but there's no doubt the online world we're going to be spending more and more time here.
Thanks very much, John. And I guess given the year we've all had, I think any bit of good news is a positive. So thank you for even a bit of good news. Just a follow-up question, kind of pivoting from cyber and disinformation and focusing more on how to promote human rights and the rule of law. If you could kind of take a moment to speak to the role that a large multinational company like Microsoft can play in advancing human rights and the rule of law, and whether that involves the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights or the SDGs, just kind of give us a sense of what large companies can do in that space. Thank you.
Yeah, well, again, it was out of some challenges that I think we all appreciate how important it is that we just build human rights analysis into everything we do. There was the Jerry Yang hearing in Congress, 15 years or 20 years ago that really we were all kind of shocked to have hometown member of Congress being so blunt with the industry. At Microsoft, we have a human rights team, and they sit in my UN affairs team. But we have 3 human rights specialists who consult on a variety of questions. And so, for example, whether it's how do we do business in countries where human rights are challenged, and it's considered a positive influence when we're there, and yet we don't want to become complicit in exploiting people or harming their human rights. And so it's often a question of yes or no, but it's also a question of how do we do it. And I think that that's very important. The recent Chinese changes with Hong Kong have led to a whole series of questions about how do we work through those questions. How do we protect our customers? How do we deal with this fairly fundamental change in the status of Hong Kong? And so I think that having a human rights team that is lawyers and professionals who can consult, but also listen. We don't have all these answers ourselves. We need to be engaged in conversation with the human rights community to learn from them, to share opinions. We're not always going to agree, but having that engagement is important. Broadly, another thing we do is we support the UN Office of Human Rights, both financially and technologically. We've worked together to create essentially a monitoring capability for them called RightsView. But really the idea is that in some countries, when human rights decline, they decline rapidly and can lead to very bad things. And so if we can engage, help them engage more quickly, they can be more effective.
Great. Thanks very much, John. Let's move on to Niall. Niall, you have expansive responsibilities involving physical security, retail and supply chain protection, travel, environmental compliance, emergency preparedness. These are all arenas that are sort of rapidly changing, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crises. What are the most salient emergent threats that are on your radar within sort of this global security management space?
Yeah, thanks, Howie, and thanks to the Global Center for having me on today. As your question acknowledges, the threat environment over the last, certainly over the last 10 to 20 years, and certainly even before that, has become a much more complicated place. But in the last decade or so, for commercial organizations, there's been a challenge of catch-up. I think for any organization, regardless of what its business is, you can sort of break down the threat environment into 3 broad categories today. I would say first, there's sort of adversarial threats to assets, information, data, and intellectual property. Basically the stock and trade of whatever an organization's raison d'etre is. Then the second category would be sort of adversarial actions or adversarial threats to people and facilities, and terrorism would fall in this area. Finally, then there's that third category of sort of natural disasters, acts of God, pandemics, as well as just general catastrophic events. So the greatest challenge for security practitioners in this environment is, or the secret sauce, if you will, is to sort of anticipate and to have a plan. And again, where the threats are varied and constantly evolving, it's often not possible to anticipate every single threat and the permutations of how it'll manifest. But nonetheless, understanding the sort of categories of threats that an organization will face sort of help you develop that plan. Fortunately, there's been a major evolution, I think, in the private sector towards a more predictive, proactive approach towards security. I think government had its moment of awakening with the events of 9/11, and while that certainly played out in other quarters as well, it was existential for government. I think the digital revolution has really done that to the private sector, and it's been sort of the catalyst for the private sector to adopt more integrated, agile security models. So the good news is that that evolution is underway in private industry, and many forward-thinking organizations are creating those kind of models where security is an organic business process in and of itself within the organization. Very much so in the past, I think security was sort of an afterthought for many organizations because it wasn't a core function of the organization's business. It was really kind of a peripheral concern that was accessed, only when something went wrong. And thus it sort of had a culture off to the side. But today we're starting to see, as I said, the digital revolution is sort of speeding up everything, including these evolutions that I'm referring to. But the digital revolution has certainly sort of brought security into the forefront and made it, as I said, an organic business process that's really present throughout the entire life cycle of an organization's operations, from product development, product inception, through development, through marketing and dissemination, and through ongoing relationships with clients and customers. So these models are out there and they're replicable on a scalable level for organizations of different size. So while I think the private sector sort of en masse has a long way to go in terms of sort of catching up to what the threat environment is like, there's, as I said, there's models out there that the forward-thinking practitioner can look to improve their own posture. And frankly, they're going to need it because if we go back to those three broad categories I spoke about, let's take them one at a time. So the adversarial actions towards our assets and data, information, and intellectual property. Years ago, we used to think of the cyber threat, in shorthand, as emanating, in my own background was in the FBI, and, as the digital revolution sort of kicked into high gear, we used to refer to the cyber threat by, alluding to the fact that it came from a 12-year-old in their mother's basement somewhere in Eastern Europe, stealing our credit card data. Well, that threat has evolved rapidly, certainly over the last 10 to 15 years. And the truth is now it's really at the pivot point of international conflict. I mean, the threat actor space now is dominated really by nation states. So it's gone from that 12-year-old in their mother's basement to nation states putting full resources into resolving their conflicts through cyber means. And of course, that is a complicated recipe because the anonymity that the cyberspace provides and the deniability makes that a very dangerous development. The other thing is that in that space, technological innovation, while it's brought many great things to humanity, such as AI and so on, AI is also energizing the attack space as well. So a lot of our threats, fueled by nation state actors as well as highly sophisticated actors, even if they're not nation states, are now empowered by AI, thus exponentially making their capacity that much greater. On top of that, we still have, staying in that first category of threats to our intellectual property and data and so on. We still have the good old-fashioned corporate espionage that's carried out by human beings, and what we call the insider threat, where essentially individuals working inside an organization are co-opted to sort of leak and or steal the intellectual property, data, et cetera. So, that's a major challenge for any security component within an organization. Moving to the second category is that question of the adversarial actions to our people and our facilities and ultimately our customers as well. Terrorism has evolved from if we go back to it's almost a nostalgic look back to the late 90s up to 9/11. We were dealing with what was viewed as a distant threat from overseas, here in the United States. It was organizational in nature, in the sense that we could identify who the adversaries were. And it has now evolved over the last 20 years into something that lives within our midst. And it takes on a whole different series of characteristics in that activity that we would consider terrorist is emanating from groups of all different types of ideologies now, and even the increasing political and ideological divides in our own culture, supercharged by the disinformation campaigns that John referenced. They've led to terrorism becoming the preferred tool for many diverse ideologies that are not necessarily easily recognizable, and those pose a major challenge to security practitioners of commercial organizations, which are increasingly viewed as viable targets because they represent economic might. And then add to that then the disgruntled worker. Again, going back to the old-fashioned threat of what we call the active shooter, somebody who, whether it's motivated by a political ideology or just a personal slight, enters into a facility and causes that vast destruction. These are constant threats that have to be dealt with. And then finally, we're living through it now, so I don't have to spend a whole lot of time referring to the natural disasters. We've seen it with hurricanes in different parts of the country, and we're living through it right now with the pandemic. I mean, when these events that occur that really are beyond human control, that knock business continuity on its backside, are a major challenge. And again, the challenge for a security practitioner is to be able to anticipate and have some sort of plan that's both executable, but also agile to take in the varying permutations that those threats may manifest as.
Great. Thanks so much. Maybe just one follow-up question. It strikes me that terrorism is often approached through its impact on hard security or human security, typically in terms of large attacks on major cities. What about community level perspectives? Everyday security of local communities, for example, where corporations do their business and where their customers and employees live. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, and this is where private industry can play a major role as well. I mean, there's certainly in the post 9/11 era, been a major development in what's the public-private partnership space. I think there was a culture that dominated in the past of those two worlds being very separate. Now they've found points of convergence where they can work together on a lot of different issues, so that when an event happens, government no longer just says stand back, we'll take it from here, but they invite private industry in to help come up with the solution as such. And that solution can take a number of forms, as you indicated. It can come in the form of a CSR initiative at the local level that provides some sort of relief to a population suffering, whether it's from a terrorist incident or a natural disaster and so on. It can also be at a more global level, where industry is facilitating dialogue and so on crucial issues. faced by sort of all sorts of stakeholders. Ultimately, I think the partnership piece is important because industry, while it brings great resources, great knowledge, great focus to certain specific issues, I think that government participation that acts as kind of an overlay, because industry, I think, goes deep, where government has to go broad. And I think the partnership aspect of that is probably the greatest strength, because, their industry, will necessarily kind of focus on the things that are important to them, whereas I think government keeps that broader optic in view all the time.
Great, thank you so much. Let's move on to Mariko. Mariko, for you, the proliferation of laws and regulations to counter terrorism and its financing have certainly had a significant effect on shrinking the space within which civil society can operate. What has been your experience in this domain, and what role can and should philanthropic actors and civil society play as partners alongside government and the private sector in addressing some of these global security challenges?
Thanks so much. I've been really fascinated to listen to my colleagues, Neil and John and Vanda. They're very different perspectives. And so I appreciate the opportunity also to, Neil, as you said, now go a little bit broader and to think together about some of the public policy implications. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, particularly in this current moment, is the role of trust. We talk a lot about the rule of law, and the rule of law is one instantiation of a network of trust. But in order for us to think both internationally, transnationally, about countering crime, criminality, and violence, and for us to think about it and do the work nationally, that has to be a kind of nested set in a way. So you have a need for a transnational or international space of trust for conversation and coordination. You have a need at the national level. Then you have a need at multiple community levels, and each of those can kind of branch off in many directions. And one of the things that's been interesting to me as we're talking through this panel, and that happens a lot, is kind of smushing together in a way violence, criminality, terrorism, extremism. These are all, as actually Vanda described very well in her examples, these are all distinct and different. They have some crossover impacts and they have some crossover causes, but they are distinct and different. And so how those networks of trust need to nest together depends on which of those things we're trying to counter. And I really appreciated what Neil said about the different types of threats and how they require different types of approaches by different actors. I think one of the things for us to think about as we look at civil society, obviously privacy comes up a lot. It's essential that we talk about privacy. In some ways, the counterbalance to privacy is interoperability. That can be interoperability on the technical side. It can be interoperability in terms of communications between the different layers of law enforcement and those nested communities of trust that I described. But for us to think about what we're really trying to get out of interoperability. I'll speak to a US context, and we talk about and think about immigration and immigration enforcement. There are all kinds of networks of interoperability that were put in place post 9/11 and then built on in ways that, in my personal view, have had significant negative effects, and people have tried to build on them in a variety of different ways. And we have to keep coming back to what is the purpose? What is it that we're trying to accomplish with these various networks of interoperability, and how do they undermine those networks of trust that are actually absolutely essential to the practice of law enforcement and the countering of violence and the countering of hazards. So I think for us to think about these questions from those kinds of angles is essential as we think about what kind of policies do we want to put in place. I also wanted to kind of pull forward something that John mentioned about root causes. I mean, we tend to talk about root causes in a way that, John didn't do this, but in the public sphere, we tend to talk about them in a way that actually locates the cause at the community level. And I would love to see us move away from talking about quote unquote root causes to talking about structural and systemic causes and root solutions. Because I think it's really important that solutions to the example that again, I think John gave about the community members, and especially the younger people coming in and saying like, oh, those counter narratives, those are, I don't know what they said, if they said they were funny or they said they were just simply not going to be effective. But those kinds of conversations are essential, you know, at the government level and perhaps also at the private sector. We spend a lot of time and effort and money pushing out our own ideas of solutions without really consulting with the communities that we are trying to engage. And asking them, inviting them to be the crafters of the solutions, which also requires us to invite them to be the describers of the problem. And I think sometimes we go and we say, here's what we think the problem is, how would you solve this problem? Instead of saying, what do you think the problem is? Okay, what tools do we collectively bring to bear to that solution, to try to craft a solution with the tools that the government has, that philanthropy has, that the private sector has. We don't do that problem definition and that question definition first. We come at it with a definition like violent extremism or countering terrorism. And as Neil pointed out, you know, we now have violent extremism coming from, in the United States perspective, all kinds of corners. And in fact, we have been over certainly the last 10 years or so blinded, I think, to our own the range of versions of homegrown violence and extremism and terrorism that are possible. If you think back, for example, to the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a report that was to be issued on violent white extremism, and it was kind of shelved because that was not deemed to be a viable conversation. And now, in many ways, we are facing up to that. So I think to think about the role that governments play in relationship to one another, to think about the role, and I'm talking about national governments, to think about the role that national governments play in relationship to, in the US case, state governments, and then down to cities and local police forces, and the ways in which we actually kind of narrow the organizational psychological space that's available to all those organizations by the assumptions that are embedded in our definitions. And so we are keeping, even those organizations that we task with keeping us safe and secure, we're limiting their sense of possibility and imagination about what the threats might be. I think Neil used the word either anticipating or preparedness, and we can't be prepared. We can't anticipate if we're not actually thinking forward in that way and enabling ourselves to be creative. That's an incredibly important role for civil society to bring. And there have to be, you know, as I say to my kids, there have to be listening ears on the other side, right? There has to be a receptivity on the other side, on the law enforcement side, to rethinking the structures and rigidities that we have created for ourselves as a way of trying to, in a sense, pretend that we have control over something that we don't have control over. And so for us to think together about how those nested networks of trust can work, as opposed to how this rigid frame can be pushed down into a variety of different systems, I think is essential. And I would just add one other note, because of the range of audience members we have. I think that absolutely goes as well in terms of international security assistance coming from the US side, the kinds of exporting that we do of particular ideas of criminality and policing, and the way that we think about the relationship between the movement of people and goods, transnational networks of violence and criminality, and individual instantiations of violence and criminality, that we really have to examine those things and pull them apart. And I think there are roles for civil society in each of those layers.
Thanks very much, Mariko. Maybe just one follow-up question. When it comes to leadership and organizational development, just with everything going on in the world right now, rising nationalism, xenophobia, heavy-handed security responses, what advice do you have for current leaders and future leaders about how to adapt and meet these changing demands?
I think the first thing is to recognize that we are all engaged in multiple complex systems and subsystems. That linear, the search for kind of linear pat answers, if you get in that, you know you're wrong. And that we are in an extended phase of uncertainty that can have positive impacts. We can see that it also has major negative impacts. But being prepared for uncertainty and not actually focusing as much energy on searching for certainty so that you can see and engage the uncertainty that presents and have that kind of resilience and preparedness, as opposed to the kind of resilience and preparedness that means you have, a stockpile of toilet paper, right? Or a stockpile of certain kinds of equipment that are angled towards a particular set of possibilities, because it's actually impossible to prepare for all of those possibilities. The thing to do is to be able to shift and move yourself and your organization in moments of uncertainty.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks again to all of our panelists for what has been up to this point a fruitful conversation.